Olga, a successful and ambitious photographer, was famous for her work capturing forgotten, gloomy places in the city. Her attention was always drawn to abandoned buildings, abandoned factories, dilapidated churches, where it seemed that everything was gone except the memory of what once was. One day she heard from her architect friend about an abandoned psychiatric clinic on the outskirts of the city. This place was surrounded by myths about strange sounds, mysterious disappearances, and inexplicable phenomena, but Olga decided that these were just legends created for impressionable people. The stranger the stories, the more they attracted her. The clinic stood several kilometers from the nearest village, and over the years of abandonment it became completely surrounded by wild forest. The road to the building itself looked ominous, a barely distinguishable path, on both sides of which dead branches hung, as if preventing passage. Her friends begged her not to go alone, but Olga only grinned, confident in her abilities. "If something interesting does come up, I'll handle it," she said confidently. As soon as Olga entered the building, she was overcome by a strange anxiety. The corridors were covered with a thick layer of dust, but some doors, strangely, had fresh scratches, as if someone had tried to get out from the inside. In the room, which looked like a former dining room, the tables and chairs were in complete disarray, and the objects scattered on the floor looked as if someone had recently left them in a hurry. Walking further, Olga noticed that the air in the room had become denser and heavier. The walls were covered with something like dark mold, emitting a foul odor. At some point, she felt as if someone was watching her. But every time she looked back, there was only an empty, dark corridor stretching into infinity. On one of the floors, she came across an office where, according to legend, the head doctor conducted his special research. Dust covered the floor and old furniture, but one of the shelves was carefully cleaned and empty, as if its contents had just been removed. On the table lay a folder with yellowed notes. After carefully reading several pages, Olga realized that these were reports of patients who had undergone cruel experiments. Most of them described strange hallucinations, but one entry particularly struck her. Subject 51 admits the presence of a creature pulling him into an unknown darkness. The patient claims that in the mirror he sees not himself, but something dark with glowing eyes. While trying to take a photo of the office, Olga heard the scraping of metal coming from the floor below. Startled, she went down, pointing her camera into the darkness. The corridor below was gloomy and dark, lit only by the occasional flashes of her flashlight. As she passed the rooms, she noticed that some of the doors were slightly open, and faint whispers could be heard inside. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind playing in the abandoned walls, but the feeling of something inexplicable was growing stronger. While in one of the last rooms, Olga saw a strange silhouette in the mirror standing in the corner. In the reflection, her own features were distorted. A distorted face looked at her, eyes wide open, as if warning of danger. Gathering her courage, she stepped towards the mirror and carefully touched it. At that moment, she was hit with an icy cold, and it seemed as if the reflection began to pull her inward. Olga barely took her hand off the glass and hurried out of the room, but found that the corridor she had come down had changed. The walls seemed to have shifted, forming a strange labyrinth, unlike anything she had seen before. In a panic, she tried to find a way out, but every room she entered was just an empty, dark space, reminiscent of scraps of her own consciousness. After wandering for several hours, Olga realized that she was trapped. Her every move was reflected in mirrors standing in unexpected places, and each reflection looked more and more frightening. At some point, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was her own voice, coming from the depths of the mirror. She began to run, but the path she was moving along became shorter and shorter, and the space around her became more and more closed. Eventually, she came across an open door. Behind it was a room, empty except for a large mirror in the center. Realizing that this was her last chance, Olga moved closer and looked at her reflection again. But this time it wasn't her in the mirror. A strange, dark figure with glowing eyes and a shadow enveloping her face was looking at her. The figure extended its hand toward the glass, and Olga felt her own hand begin to move, obeying the will of this entity. A second later, her consciousness faded. She felt something cold and sinister pulling her into the darkness. Her body seemed to dissolve, and she realized that she herself had now become a part of this mirror, one of those who were forever trapped in the reflection.